It's not exclusively about the fuel price changes, although that is certainly what has triggered these protests that are happening in a number of regions across this large country of Kazakhstan. It came after the cap on liquefied petroleum gas was lifted in the new year, a long-coming change, but one that effectively overnight doubled the cost of LPG for the many, many Kazakhs that use this type of fuel to power their cars, particularly in Western Kazakhstan. And it is there that these protests were sparked. They then spread to the biggest city, Almaty, no longer the capital, but the biggest city in the country, and one that has traditionally seen big numbers of people come out onto the streets when there are protests. But certainly the demands have stretched beyond this particular issue. They say that they want to see problems with corruption addressed, living standards improved more generally, and the resignation of the government earlier today, an attempt to mollify the protesters, doesn't seem to have calmed the situation on the streets of Almaty or elsewhere in the country.
Now, this is not a country where we're used to seeing major street protests, demonstrations, violence for that matter. Here, you mentioned the resignation of the government as an attempt to basically calm the streets down. What is the overall political situation in Kazakhstan? What do we know about how people view the government?
Protests are certainly rare in Kazakhstan. There were sporadic ones in 2016, the last time we saw quite large protests, much bigger ones in 2011, but certainly not a common sight in a relatively authoritarian country. It is the richest country in Central Asia, and the living standards are considered to be higher than in most other parts of this part of the world. But certainly there are concerns among many people in Kazakhstan that the oil wealth the country generates doesn't always trickle down to the people, and that is why this frustration has really broken out on the streets in the last few days, when people are having to fork out more money for their energy, for their transport. But certainly this is a country that has been ruled by one man for a very long time, since the end of the Soviet era. Nursultan Nazarbayev, who is no longer the president of the country after stepping down a couple of years ago. He now runs the Security Council and for all intents and purposes still controls the country, with a president, of course, Tokayev, who has been in power for the last few years. But there are still concerns among many Kazakh citizens that Nazarbayev is the one still pulling the strings. But certainly Tokayev has been trying to quell the situation on the streets of Kazakh cities in the last few days by trying to make some sort of concessions, saying that a price cap will be reintroduced, at least in the western part of Kazakhstan, and that socio-economic demands will be considered in the coming days.
Now, from a wider geopolitical perspective here, unrest in this part of the world has caught the attention of typically neighboring states here with much alarm. In Russia in particular, is this considered a problematic arena that's now getting the attention of the top echelon?
It will certainly be worrying to those in the Kremlin who will be watching on events in Kazakhstan. Of course, Moscow and Kazakhstan have quite close relations. They are very good allies and have been for many years since the end of the Soviet Union. So certainly President Vladimir Putin will be watching with concern how events develop in Kazakhstan, and instability on the fringes of Russia's spheres of influence as it sees them will not be welcome at a time when Russia is entering into security conversations with the West over the situation in Ukraine in the coming days. It won't be a welcome distraction, and it will certainly be hoped that this situation can be resolved before those talks get underway next week.
Julia Chapman in Moscow, thank you very much.